Let's look at number 3. We're looking for an assumption that the argument depends on. So let's read the argument, see if we can find the whole. So we found bovine remains in a certain region of Africa from a time where the climate was arid. And while there were no people in the region at this time, there were no other large mammals either. And then it says any natural sources of water that would have been available to these bovines would have brought other large mammals in as well. Okay, we're about to read the conclusion of the argument because we have the word thus. We were just given a bunch of information and now it's going to say thus, therefore here's our final conclusion. So what might be a good idea sometimes in this spot, very often a good strategy, is to put everything together that we know and see what conclusion we could make. See how far we can get with the information we're given. And then when they give us the conclusion, we can see the gap between those two things, right? Because we have to get the assumption that's going to get us from what we know. What do we have to assume along with what we already know that's going to get us to our conclusion? So let's figure out what we already know. Let's put it all together. Let's see how far we can get. And then let's see what the conclusion says. And then we'll see the difference between those two things. And that's what has to be assumed. That's what wasn't said that has to be assumed. So we were basically told a couple things here. We were saying that there were no other large mammals in this region. But then the next sentence says something about large mammals, right? So we can connect these two things. The next sentence says that if there were natural sources of water, that would have brought other large mammals. So if we put 2 and 2 together, that means there were no natural sources of water. Because it says if there were, there would have been other large mammals, but there weren't large mammals. So even though it never says there were no large sources of water, no natural sources of water rather, even though it never says that directly, we can infer that from putting these two statements together, right? So if we put all this together, we can get as far as saying that there were no natural sources of water where these bovines were. And then we use that information to get to the conclusion that therefore they must have been, let's read the conclusion, therefore these bovines must have been domesticated. And the people that were living in this region must not have been exclusively hunter-gatherers, right? They must have been domesticating animals, in other words. So the conclusion is that these bovines were domesticated. Again, why? Because there were no sources of water. There were no natural sources of water available to them. So therefore, they must have been domesticated, right? So we just simplified. Look at how simple we made it. Support, conclusion. Support, there were no natural sources of water. Therefore, conclusion, they must have been domesticated. It makes sense, right? Because if they were wild animals, why would they be hanging out in a place where there was no natural source of water? So logically, it kind of makes logical sense, right? If there was no water, then they must have been there because humans domesticated them there. But anyway, that's the point. That's the assumption, right? The assumption of every argument is if support, then conclusion. Every argument assumes that the support leads to the conclusion. So the support is that there was no natural source of water. The conclusion is that, therefore they must have been domesticated. We are assuming that if there's no natural source of water, then that proves that these bovines must have been domesticated. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been there. So let's look for that assumption in the answer choices. A says unless they are domesticated. So unless means if not. So this is another way of saying that if they're not domesticated, then bovines are not likely to exist in a region where there's no natural sources of water. Now this is a double negative. This is saying if they're not domesticated, then they're not going to live in a region with no natural water source. So let's flip and negate it. Let's take the contrapositive of this statement to make it a little easier to understand because we have an if not, then not. So let's flip it and negate it. So if we flip and negate it, if we take the contrapositive of this statement, it turns into that if bovines do exist in a region where there's no natural sources of water, then they must probably be domesticated. That's exactly the assumption we're looking for, right? And that's another way of saying A. Again, we don't have to think about it so mechanically in terms of the contrapositive. We can just read the sentence, right? That's one way to do it, but you can also just read the sentence and realize that that's what that means, right? A is saying unless they're domesticated, you're probably not going to find them in a place where there's no natural sources of water. So that means if you did find them in a place where there's no natural sources of water, they're probably domesticated. In other words, if support, then probably conclusion. That's exactly the assumption we're looking for, right? Because the support was that there was no natural sources of water here, and the conclusion was therefore they were probably domesticated. So A is correct. B, do we have to assume that domesticating animals is one of the very first practices that a society has to adopt in order to change from being hunter-gatherers to agriculture? I don't see why we would have to assume this, right? Why would we have to assume that it's one of the first things that they must adopt? The conclusion is saying that these people were domesticating animals, and therefore they must not have just been hunter-gatherers. They must have been domesticating animals too, right? But who's to say that that was the first thing that they started doing? Maybe they started doing other things that were part of their transition from hunter-gatherers first. Maybe this was only step 4 in their transition away from being hunter-gatherers. So it doesn't really matter whether it was first or 10th or 47th. It really doesn't make a difference. So therefore, this doesn't seem to be a relevant assumption. C, do we have to assume that with the help of humans, other large mammals would have also been able to inhabit this arid region? So C is saying that we have to assume that humans would have been able to domesticate other animals and bring them to this region as well. Why would we have to assume that? There were no other large mammals. The paragraph told us so. The paragraph said there were no other large mammals there. We're trying to show that the humans must have domesticated the bovines, right? C is saying, well, you know, had they wanted to, they could have domesticated other large mammals too. Okay, but they didn't. Why would we have to assume that they could have, right? We're trying to show that they domesticated the bovines. C is saying, well, by the way, they could have domesticated other animals too. Okay, maybe that's true. Maybe that's not true. Maybe they could have only domesticated the bovines. Maybe they had the option to domesticate other animals and they chose not to. That's neither here nor there. It doesn't have to be assumed. D, do we have to assume that there's no human culture that gets food both through agriculture and through hunting and gathering? D is saying that we have to assume that there's no such thing as a hybrid human culture. It's either one or the other. Now, why would we have to assume that? In fact, that seems to go against the conclusion. The conclusion seems to be suggesting that they were doing both, right? The conclusion says that the people living in this region were no longer exclusively hunter-gatherers. It seems to suggest that they were maybe partially hunter-gatherers, but they weren't exclusively so, right? So it seems to suggest that they were doing a little bit of both, right? So D kind of contradicts with that. D says, no, there's no such thing as a human culture that does both. You're either one or the other, right? So it certainly doesn't have to be assumed. If anything, it seems to go against the implication of the conclusion, so certainly not the right answer. E is an assumption about the quantity of water needed by domesticated versus wild animals. E says we have to assume that domesticated animals of a given size don't need as much water as wild animals of that same size. Now, the argument told us that these animals must have been domesticated. You know why? Because there were no natural sources of water in the region, so therefore there must have been some domestication going on here. Now, that doesn't mean that the animals need less water, right? We're not saying, oh, they're domesticated, they need less water than a wild animal would need. Why would that be the case, right? It just means that because there were no natural sources of water and they were hanging out in this region, oh, they must have been domesticated by humans, right? But that doesn't mean they didn't need as much water. It could be that the humans were giving them water some other way, right? So all we have to assume is that the fact that there were no natural sources of water proves that they were domesticated. But that doesn't mean that they, as living beings, needed less water than had they been wild. Maybe they needed just as much water. It's just that they weren't getting their water from natural water sources. Instead, since they were domesticated, maybe the humans were taking care of them in some other way, giving them some other water source. So E is certainly not an assumption that has to be made. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.